welcome back for this week's episode of Photoshop Fridays. This week we're doing episode 16, and what we're going to do is talk about something a little less Photoshop and a little bit more photography in general. Now, the idea here that we're going to discuss is all about the exposure triangle, and it's something that I think is really misunderstood by a lot of people in general who are maybe new to photography, just getting into shooting manual, and sometimes people who have had a little bit more experience with it but are still running into some troubles with images. Things like low light situations or subjects are maybe blurry, and how you can correct that using the settings in your camera. And the reason we're talking about this on a Photoshop Friday is when you take your images and you're using your camera in the field, the more you can get right in camera, the less you're going to need to correct in post. So without any further ado, let's get into talking about the exposure triangle. All right, so here's a very common chart that people will see when they're looking up information on the exposure triangle. And now, what makes up this triangle are the three basics of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now, there's always sort of a thought that there could be a little bit more to the triangle, and let's call it the exposure diamond, when you start introducing things like flash, which are artificial light. So we're just talking about the absolute basic aspect, which is ISO, shutter, and aperture. Now, to start out, let's start with the bottom here of this chart. So we're going to talk about ISO. Now, ISO is your camera's sensor's sensitivity to light as a whole. And how this is the higher the ISO you go. So in this chart here, the further to the right you go, the less of a shutter speed you will need. So a very high ISO will allow you to get a quicker shutter speed in your shots. Now that does come with a downside. So the further you increase your ISO, so you can start at 50, and the higher and higher you go. So in this chart we've got 25,600. The higher you are, the more grain or the more noise that you're going to get in your images. Now, where this is tolerable varies drastically with equipment, cameras, your sensor quality, a whole bunch of stuff. So what you might find is that on some crop sensor or entry-level models that we know a lot of you guys are shooting, you might find that the noise in your images becomes unbearable as low as even ISO 400. Some other cameras perform much better, especially when you're looking at full frame models, where you can go ISOs into 6400, 12,000, 25, even up into 50,000 ISO, while still getting a respectably low noise image. So what you'll want to do with your equipment when you're looking at ISO to get a better understanding of how your equipment reacts to this is take a series of images. You can even go into, a auto mode, for example, and you can adjust your ISO and say, let's take a frame at 50, at 100, at 200, at 400, so on and so forth. And look at each image in your camera, and you will see that there's a point in that series where your ISO is generating too much noise. And that point where it's too much is going to vary drastically person to person. So spend a little time, do a series of shots, and find out with your gear where your point of your comfort level with the amount of noise exists. All right, the next piece of this we want to talk about is actually going to be the shutter speed. And with shutter speed, that is going to help to control how well you freeze motion in your camera. Now, there isn't a magic shutter speed that's going to work for every scenario. What freezes motion is always dependent on what that motion is. So a much faster moving object may require a much faster shutter speed to freeze. So if we look at this here, you'll see that, for example, ISO 1/1000th of a second is freezing our subject relatively well. As you go down to a half second, a very quick moving object is going to be very blurry at a half a second. Now, you may find, for example, that if you're doing portraits or your handheld shots, you may still get a very crisp image at 1/125th of a second or 1/250th of a second. It's really going to depend on how steady your hands are. What are you shooting? Is it an adult who can sit very still, or are you dealing with toddlers and kids who are going to wiggle all over the place, where you might not be able to actually freeze their motion where you would as an adult? So you want to, again, always adjust that point where you're freezing motion is not going to be consistent. So it's be aware of the subject, what you're shooting. Don't be afraid to look at a shot and see and adjust accordingly. So shutter speed is all about freezing your subject. The next piece that we're going to talk about is probably one of the biggest points of contention, I think, when it comes to these charts, where the information that's presented to you isn't exactly accurate. And where that comes into place is around aperture. Now, with aperture, you've got a range of apertures that are available to you, or f-stops that are available on your lens. Not everyone's lens is going to be able to go down to 1.4 or even 1.8. Some of you shooting with that nifty 50 lens will find that you might have that 1.8 or that 1.4 available to you. Others who maybe are shooting with kit lenses, you may be more in the f4 or f5.6 range as the most open aperture that you can get. Now, with this, where my point of contention comes here is with these graphics that show depth of field being very blurred out at 1.4, very crisp at f32. Generally, yes, that would be sort of true. And what we mean by this is there is a depth of field thing where you've got your focal point where you can put your lens, focus on a certain point, and you're going to get an infinite depth of field. And what you got with that is your ability of the aperture to blur a background is equally as dependent not only on the f-stop that you choose, but where in the scene you choose to focus. Now, it is very possible shooting a landscape scene to shoot an image at f2.8 and get an extremely deep depth of field. You're going to have things that are reasonably close to the camera, out to the horizon, that are in focus, and you can achieve that at f2 or f2.8 just as easily as you can at f16. Now, by using this idea of hyperfocal focus, which we'll cover in a different video, if you're at f2.8 and you want to get your entire scene into focus, what you need to do is pick a point to focus that's further away from the camera. And by doing that, you're going to expand the back end of focus further out into the scene. Now, your trade-off is that things that are much closer to your camera may start being more and more out of focus. So it depends on the scene that you're in, how much of the foreground is visible to you. If you really don't have that much, say your nearest foreground object in your scene is maybe 30 or 40 feet away, if you focus at that point, you may get almost out to the horizon, even at an f4 or an f2.8. So it is relative. In a very generic sense, yes, a 1.4 aperture will result in a clear subject with a very blurry background, which is true if that subject is close enough to your camera. f32, which we definitely don't recommend using the edge apertures on your lens, so you might be shooting it more realistically, an f8, f11, maybe an f16. Depending where your subject is, again, you will get foreground and background very much in focus. So what we're going to do is cover up this scene, because this is very much relative to how your scene is, how it is composed, and where you have focused. So we're going to hide that part from the scene here. So now we're talking about just aperture, shutter, and ISO. All right, so looking at these as a picture, so now we know individually what each of these elements does in terms of composing a properly exposed and with the desired amount of blur and noise in your image, how each of these components plays into that overall image that you're creating. So what we want to talk about is the idea of stops of light. So for example, if we look at aperture, you might say, let's choose an f.8, for example. To go from f1.8 to f5.6, you are changing your exposure by one stop of light. If you go to f5.6 to f4, again, that is one stop of light. Now if you go 4 to 8, that is 2 stops of light. You're reducing the amount of light coming into the camera by 2 stops. So this ties into when people say that you're using exposure compensation on your image. Maybe you've set it to -1 or -2. You're removing stops of light from the exposure in your camera. The same actually applies when you're talking about shutter speed. So if we go f1/125th to 1/60th, you have increased by 1 stop of light. And the exact same applies when you're talking ISO. So if we go from, let's say, ISO 200 to 400, that is also 1 stop of light. Now, this is very important when we're talking about images and getting a proper exposure. And this is part of why I say when I post images in the community that I never include my ISO, shutter speed, or aperture. I don't include that EXIF data in my post. And part of it is that it is in a way very much relevant. You've either properly exposed an image or you haven't properly exposed it. You either have the depth of field you want or you don't, or the motion is frozen or it's not. That is much more important than simply all the stats of how you did a shot, because no one's going to be able to take that camera, choose those same settings, and then get a properly exposed image. It's going to vary greatly. You can stand in a scene, be taking portraits of people, stand in one spot and turn your body, and as you turn more towards or away from the sun, being physically in the same place, your exposure is going to change. So unless somebody is using those settings with the exact same light, exact same direct, everything about the image is the same settings will never actually work for them. So what we will do here is, I've got some markers here. So let's say we have done an image and we say it is f8 1/250th of a second at ISO 400. So what we can do here is we talk about stops of light. You may say f8, you know what? F8 is going to give you the depth in the scene that you want for what's in focus. 1/250th, it's doing a pretty good job of freezing your subject, and you got ISO 400. Now, let's say that you look at the scene and ISO 400 is a bit too much grain for you. So what you're going to do is you're going to take from ISO 400 and you're going to reduce this down to ISO 200. So what we've done is reduced the exposure. We've eliminated 1 stop of light. So by doing that, what you're going to end up with is this image is going to be slightly underexposed if you make no change to shutter speed and no change to aperture. So we've reduced 1 stop down to ISO 200. Now you can compensate for that by taking your shutter speed and going from 1/250th up to 1/125th. And why this works is that each of these stops, either in shutter speed, ISO, or aperture, always represents 1 stop of light. So if you have gone from ISO 400 to 200, so reduced 1 here, but you added one from 250 to 1/125th, your exposure here will be exactly the same as the first frame. Again, you can say maybe you get too much motion, so you take 1/125th, put it up to 250, but you reduce your f-stop down to 5.6. This will also result in the exact same exposure as both of the previous shots. So as long as you're balancing removing and adding of a stop of light, either through aperture, shutter speed, or ISO, you're going to end up with the same exposures. So again here, let's go here, let's grab this, let's put that here at 60, let's put this at f8, and let's come in here to ISO 800. So the same is going to apply as you do more and more stops. So let's say I go from 1/60th and I reduce that down to 1/250th. So I've removed 2 stops of light from this. You can go and you could increase your aperture from f8 to f.4 to add in those 2 stops. You could also go ISO 800 up to 3200. You could also go and say, I want to do 1 stop f-stop and 1 ISO. You've still added in the additional 2 stops of light. You just did 1 stop under aperture and 1 stop under ISO. So you can see how these here will always balance out. So for example, the first one where you had f8, 1/160th, ISO 800 will result in the exact same exposure that we have with our changes of f5.6, 1/250th of a second, and ISO 1600. So your exposure will be identical. Now, in making those changes, we of course have added in some more noise to the image. We have reduced the depth of field in our image ever slightly, but purely from an exposure standpoint, it will be identical. So you can see how when you post your settings on a shot and you say my ISO was this, my shutter was this, and my aperture was this, that is very much contingent on the scene. Those just happen to be the settings that were required to produce a proper exposure given the light at the moment, the scene, the direction you were facing, the colors. You know, if someone's wearing a white shirt versus a dark shirt, that's going to alter because there's more light being reflected back into the camera. But you could say, you know, if you went in here, you could say, you know what, I did this shot and it was at f32, so I removed from here 1, 2, 3, 4 stops of light. I did 1 here, and I did 3 more here. Again, identical exposure. So you could pick anything from this chart as long as you've properly added and removed stops of light, and you'll end up with the exact same exposure regardless of the image. All right, so there's some of the basics of the exposure triangle in your camera and ways that you can play with these settings to start creating the images that you want. Now with that, we talked a lot about stops of light and threw some numbers in there, tried to explain the different components of creating an image. One thing that you always want to consider is pick something what's most important to you in the scene and adjust the other settings accordingly. So for example, if a low noise image is your main priority in that particular shot, prioritize going down to ISO 50 or ISO 100 or 200. Make sure you've got that low noise shot. If the resultant here is you are doing, let's say, a portrait, let's say you go ISO 100, you go to like an aperture of like 1.8, and you're still getting a little bit of motion blur in your subject, you have an option of maybe going from 1.8 to 2 or 2.8, or maybe you want to accept a little bit more noise in your shot to get that shutter speed higher. You can also look at it and say, I don't want the noise, I don't want the added depth of field. Your next solution is adding more light. So you're looking at things like external flash, bouncing light in, natural light, things like that. So there's a lot of pieces to it, but understanding those basics of how to get a proper exposure and adjust accordingly whether you're shooting in manual or semi-auto modes on your camera. And ultimately the end goal for us is to get an image that meets our criteria, whether that be grand depth of field for nature photographers, short depth of field for portrait photographers, low noise, high noise, whatever it is that is important to you in an image. Make sure you choose settings that are going to get you to the goal that you want. So that's it for this week. It's going to be a real short video, but we want to cover topics that are very important and that come up in the community a lot in questions. Now, in an upcoming video, we are going to talk about doing a hyperfocal focusing, which is going to be a little bit more technical, but that's going to help to sort of fill in that gap of why f-stop isn't always a guarantee of shallow depth of field or long depth of field. So watch for that in the next coming weeks. Other than that, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up below. Subscribe to that channel. We're still trying to build up that base just a little bit. And if you want to contribute to the content that is being created, make sure you visit my Patreon account. Link can be found right down here at the bottom, more or less right there. And that's patreon.com/jschwellinger. Thank you everyone, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Photoshop Fridays.